On November 25, 1177, a dying 16-year-old boy with bandaged hands and 500 knights faced down 26,000 of Islam's finest warriors. By sunset, the most powerful Muslim army in the world lay shattered, and history's most unlikely military genius had written his legend in blood. Think about those numbers for a second. 500 against 26,000. That's a 52-to-1 disadvantage. The fate of Christian civilization in the Holy Land hung by a thread so thin it was invisible. Yet by the end of this story, you'll understand how a teenage leper king achieved the impossible, why Saladin made the fatal error that cost him everything, and what really happened in those savage moments when faith collided with steel. The year 1177 marked the darkest hour for the Crusader kingdoms. For nearly 8 decades, Christian knights had clung to their precarious footholds in the Holy Land. But now the tide was turning, and turning fast. The great Crusader fortresses that once dominated the landscape were falling one by one, their defenders overwhelmed by a resurgent Islamic world united under one man, Saladin. But in Jerusalem, something extraordinary occupied the throne. Baldwin IV, crowned at 13, carried a curse that should have killed him years ago. Leprosy, the disease medieval minds saw as God's own judgment. By 16, his body was failing. His hands, wrapped in silk bandages, could barely grip a sword. His face, hidden behind a silver mask, concealed features ravaged by disease. Courtiers whispered he was cursed by God. Yet, somehow, impossibly, he ruled with a clarity that stunned friend and foe alike. Facing him stood Saladin, the sword of Islam, a leader who combined military genius with genuine piety. At 40, he'd united Egypt and Syria, forging the most powerful Muslim state since the early caliphates. His army had crushed every force sent against it. His reputation alone could empty castles without firing a shot. While Baldwin fought his own decaying body, Saladin commanded an empire stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. The power dynamic was laughably one-sided. The Crusader states, fractured by internal rivalries, could muster perhaps 15,000 men total, scattered across dozens of castles and cities. Saladin commanded over 100,000 warriors, with the wealth of Egypt funding endless campaigns. It wasn't a question of if the Crusaders would fall, but when. Jerusalem's nobles already made secret preparations for exile. Ships waited in the ports. Treaties were quietly negotiated. The smart money said the kingdom of Jerusalem had months, maybe weeks. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Baldwin IV wasn't just fighting Saladin, he was racing against his own body, knowing each battle might be his last, each victory purchased with agony no healthy man could endure. As autumn turned to winter in 1177, intelligence reports brought terrifying news. Saladin was massing the largest army of his career, 26,000 mounted warriors, including his elite Mamluk cavalry. Their destination was obvious, Jerusalem itself. The city's garrison numbered less than 1,000 men. The arithmetic of annihilation was simple. Inside Jerusalem's throne room, Baldwin IV faced a decision that would define history. His advisors begged him to flee. A leper king of 16 had no business leading a last stand. But Baldwin, carried to the war council on a litter because walking had become agony, spoke with a voice that made hardened crusaders weep. "I may die tomorrow or in 10 years, but I will die as I lived defending this kingdom." The mathematics of survival were brutal. Baldwin could muster only 500 knights, including 80 Knights Templar, warrior monks who took vows to never retreat, never surrender, never show mercy to Islam's warriors. Supporting them were barely 3,000 infantry, many of them local levies with more courage than training. Together, they faced annihilation. Saladin's host was something from an apocalyptic vision. 26,000 mounted warriors, including 8,000 Mamluk slave soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of war. Each were 3 ordinary cavalry in battle. The Muslim chroniclers described it as an ocean of steel and faith. The supply train alone stretched for miles, evidence of Saladin's confidence. He wasn't planning a raid, he was planning conquest. What happened next shocked both Christian and Muslim chroniclers. Baldwin, despite hands so damaged he needed help putting on armor, insisted on personally leading the army. Templars wept openly as their king was lifted onto his horse, his body strapped to the saddle because his legs could no longer grip. His silver mask, hiding his ravaged features, gleamed in the November sun. "Look at me," Baldwin told his assembled knights. "God gave me this disease so that when we achieve victory, no man can claim it was by human strength alone." Saladin, camped near Ascalon, received reports of Baldwin's pathetic force with amusement. His emirs were already dividing up the conquered lands among themselves. Why shouldn't they be confident? The Sultan had gathered the largest Muslim army since the First Crusade. His scouts reported Jerusalem's walls were barely manned. The kingdom's best knights were scattered in distant fortresses. But Saladin made one fatal assumption, that Baldwin would wait behind Jerusalem's walls. The geography itself favored the Muslims. The lands around Montgisard offered perfect terrain for cavalry, rolling hills and open plains where numbers would tell. The autumn rains hadn't yet begun, meaning firm ground for charging horses. Every military manual, every precedent of warfare says the same thing. In open battle, the larger force wins, always. On November 23rd, Saladin bypassed the fortress of Ascalon, ignoring its garrison. Why waste time on sieges when Jerusalem itself lay defenseless? His army spread out, confident and eager, already tasting victory. Foraging parties scattered across the countryside. Discipline relaxed. After all, what threat could 500 knights pose to 26,000? But hidden in the morning mist of November 25th, Baldwin's force had left Jerusalem in a desperate march. 45 miles in 36 hours. An insane pace for healthy men, torture for a king whose body was literally falling apart. Templars took turns carrying Baldwin's litter when he lost consciousness from pain. They marched not to defend Jerusalem, but to find the one thing that might save it, Saladin's army in the worst possible position. November 25th dawned clear and hot, unusual for late autumn in the Levant. By 6 a.m., Baldwin's exhausted force had covered impossible ground, their horses foaming, men swaying with fatigue. But their scouts brought electrifying news. Saladin's army was spread across 3 miles of countryside, scattered in foraging parties, their guard completely down. The Templar Grand Master, Odo of Saint-Amand, rode to Baldwin's litter. "Sire, God has delivered them into our hands." But even he couldn't hide his shock at what their scouts reported next. The enemy numbers were even worse than feared. Not 20,000, but 26,000 warriors, their banners blackening the horizon like a storm front. Baldwin's knights reacted with visible despair. Some openly wept, others prayed. The mathematics were impossible. 52 enemies for every Christian knight. But then Baldwin did something no one expected. Despite agony that would have killed most men, he demanded to be lifted from his litter and placed on his horse. "Gentlemen," his voice rang clear despite his suffering, "David faced Goliath with faith. We faced 26,000 with God." At 11 a.m., Saladin received his first warning: dust clouds to the north, moving fast. His initial reaction was disbelief. The reports made no sense. Baldwin wouldn't dare leave Jerusalem's walls. It had to be a scouting party, nothing more. This overconfidence would cost him everything. By noon, the truth became undeniable. Crusader banners appeared on the ridgeline, the blood-red cross of the Templars, the golden crosses of Jerusalem. Saladin's scattered forces began frantically trying to reform their lines. But 3 miles is a long distance when your enemy is charging at full gallop. Here's where it gets almost unbelievable. Military logic demanded Baldwin wait. Let Saladin organize, then retreat to defensible ground. Instead, the leper king raised his bandaged hand at exactly 2 p.m., the signal his knights had been praying for.
500 lances dropped to charging position. The impossible attack had begun. But Saladin had missed one crucial detail that would doom his army. His forces were split by a natural feature invisible from distance, a series of ravines cutting through the plain. What looked like open ground was actually terrain that would funnel fleeing men into death traps. Baldwin, despite his youth, had recognized what Saladin's experience had missed. The Muslim army's reaction tells us everything about their shock. Elite Mamluks, warriors who'd faced Byzantine cataphracts and Nubian cavalry without flinching, simply froze. For precious seconds, they couldn't process what they were seeing. 500 men charging 26,000 wasn't warfare, it was mass suicide. Saladin himself, watching his invincible army disintegrate, dropped his golden mace, an action his chroniclers faithfully recorded.